Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Department of Library and Information Studies seminar, or final seminar for the semester. We have been thinking about accessing information, and we had quite a journey. We had lots of discussion on a wide variety of areas. And so we don't often get to think about accessing information or information generally from a museum's perspective. So I'm very pleased to have Dr. Shani Roper joining us this afternoon, and she'll be our presenter today. So Dr. Shani Roper is Mona Pelican, a former Irvinite and a graduate of the history department. She's a social historian with interest in public history and museums education, histories of Caribbean childhood and juvenile delinquency. She earned her PhD at Rice University. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read my notes. And she, did a postdoc work at the Smith College Department of Africana Studies. Dr. Roper is a museum's curator through and through, having begun her career at the Museum of History and Ethnography, now the National Museum of Jamaica. Division of the Institute of Jamaica, she served at Liberty Hall, that looks after the legacy of Marcus Garvey, and also was part of she curated the exhibition, for Jamaica's 50th independence celebration. She's well published, she's well known. She is the co-president of the Museums Association of the Caribbean. And so we're really grateful to have you, Dr. Roper. We are very informal here, so if Shani comes out or Stanley comes out, feel free, and the floor is yours. Welcome to Infotalks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Stanley, for inviting me to participate. This is something that we've spoken about during the course of the entire pandemic, and I'm very happy to have the discussion with you all today about how the University of the West Indies Museum went about documenting and exhibiting our COVID-19 exhibition titled Surviving COVID-19, Reflections on a Photographic Journey. Now, just as a preliminary, just to kind of give you a sense of how I've approached this presentation, I'm going to start out by just locating it in terms of what a museum does, and then how the global response occurred to the pandemic. And then from that kind of general context, reflect on our own journey at the University of the West Indies Museum. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me go to PowerPoint. Okay, thank you. So my presentation today is titled Reflections on Surviving COVID-19, an Exhibitionary and Archival Journey. Now, I want to start out by saying what a museum is. And I start out this way because I don't want to assume that everybody knows what we're doing. So a museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution that operates in service of society. It researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Our goal is to be open to the public, accessible, exclusive, foster diversity and sustainability. And then we're supposed to, as all professionals, to communicate ethically, as well as to encourage the participation of communities, offering a varied experience, educational, leisurely, reflection, and also for knowledge sharing. And this is the most recent definition that came out of global consultations under the International Council for Museums. So collections management, this exhibition and the work that a lot of my colleagues globally engaged in was around collecting the contemporary. And it's collecting the contemporary because the pandemic was this massive moment that fundamentally changed how we functioned in societies. Now, collections management is integral to a museum's strategic plan and exhibition programming, and ultimately helps to determine how we conduct our exhibitions, how we develop educational programs, and then more importantly, what we collect is also shaped by our audience, and first and foremost, our mission and mandate. So the University of the West Indies Museum, which is a younger institution, it's about 10 years old, and our mission is to research, recall, collect, conserve, interpret artifacts, text stories all around the university's history, its development, and to reflect its continuing commitment to the region that we serve. So in museological practice, there are two approaches to collecting the contemporary. And the first is a kind of strategic collections policy approach that targets any paraphernalia or material culture that is reflective of something that is happening in the present. Right? This is an approach that is usually led by the collections curatorial community within a museum. And the whole idea is to build or create interventions in a larger object collecting approach. The second approach is called participatory collecting, and it's really to encourage the community's intervention in what we collect, and refer to it in museums as being a shared authority, meaning that the curator is no longer, as it was historically, the holder of all knowledge, but rather this practice allows us to acknowledge that the community is also has authority and knowledge around what may be important at a particular moment, and that the relationship between the curator, the curatorial and objects, persons in the museum and its community, the stakeholders, those who are invested in its development, come together to have a more inclusive approach to collecting. And this is not something that we speak about theoretically. What we're going to see in the examples that I put forward is that this is actually an important part of present museum practice. So museums globally wrestled with the impact of prevention measures, both on their operations, i.e. do you remain open or do you not remain open, and also its engagement to the public. This also corresponds with the larger debates around the Black Lives Matter movements, repatriation of cultural items, as well as discussions around decolonization. How do we interpret collections? How do collections get into the museum? And what are the ethical considerations to consider if, for example, an object emerges from a history of violence and looting versus an object that emerges out of a research agenda, which is kind of the collections that emerge in the University of the West Indies. So the consequence or the impact on the museums globally would be forced closures due to financial constraints. Museums turned their gaze inwards. For those that weren't forced to close, they were able to take the time to reevaluate their collections policies, to reevaluate exhibition approaches, and then think about ways of diversifying their online offering. And so a lot of museums developed kind of hybrid programs where possible. We saw more hybrid programs in the global north, or they developed purely online content that was free, that was kind of democratized and accessible to their stakeholders and community. So I've given a few examples here. I didn't take photos, and I'm very happy to share this content with you. But each of these institutions, the first one I have here is New York Public Library. They developed a pandemic diaries program where persons submitted their recollections or their feelings and daily experiences of the pandemic. The National Museum of Bermuda had a United Together program that really had also the community interpreting the impact of the pandemic and prevention measure guidelines on their daily lives. The International Council for Museums had an exhibition, a virtual exhibition called Clothing the Pandemic, that's still up and available. And it looks at masks and kind of artistic engagements around the pandemic. Amsterdam Museum had Corona in the City, again inviting submissions from persons around the world. The other important component of this, if you're interested in finding out how museums responded to the pandemic, the Museums Association of the Caribbean had its COVID-19 survey, and that survey did an assessment on the impact of the pandemic on regional museums in the English, French, Spanish, and Dutch Caribbean. ICOM's content survey also was more global because ICOM has a very large global membership base. And then UNESCO also did a survey on museums in the world. And they did a follow-up survey on tangible heritage and approaches to tourism and other heritage sites as a result of the pandemic. So each of these kind of sets the tone for how we engage this space. Now, when it became clear that we were going to close and there was no real end date in mind for closing, we started rethinking how we engaged our public, especially the university public, because our main stakeholders would be university students, lecturers, staff, and alum. Those are our main stakeholders, and that is a very regional, when we think about it broadly, a very regional community. And so we started our work by thinking about what are our interventions during this moment, right? Because we weren't having face-to-face, the campus was closed, and we were really on, for a little while, work from home with limited interaction in the office. And so we developed a blog series, because one of the things that we recognized in the discussions that were happening around us was that people didn't have a sense of histories of pandemics in the Caribbean. And in fact, one of the things that started showing up in various forums, for example, in the United States, were these photograph collections of the Spanish flu in 1918, between 1918 and 1920. Well, let's go 1917 to 1920. And, you know, one of the striking photos that I remember now was was an anti-mask campaign in San Francisco. And one of the things that struck me, even as a historian, that I never seen a comparative photo in the Caribbean, but more importantly, that colleagues or audiences were not aware of what the diverse history of social history of medicine was. So one of the things that we did was we started out by doing a call for blog submissions, looking at the history of disease and epidemics in the Caribbean. And we received over 15 submissions covering histories of disease and public health interventions from scholars in the French, Spanish, Dutch, English Caribbean, as well as the Caribbean diaspora very broadly. These blog posts are still up for review. But one of the things that it was very clear was that, one, that there were these connected histories of public health approaches across disease epidemics over time, and that there was a kind of unevenness in terms of what was accessible. And I think about it in terms of how would I exhibit, for example, a history of disease and epidemics in the Caribbean, and what would be the resources available. And one of the things that became very clear was that it was very much archival, report based. There weren't any photographs, especially for the Spanish flu in the Caribbean. The second intervention was the Monuments in the Caribbean series, and our intervention there was also to think about what monuments are in the Caribbean in response to how the Black Lives Matter movement and the decolonize the space movement was thinking about museums, and also the first removal of the Colsa monument in the UK and how it occurred within this context of calls for removal of Lord Nelson in Barbados. And so this was a very important program. It was timely. We were able to provide significant interventions in understanding how we function, and of course, these resources, how public heritage functions in the Caribbean, especially when you're pivoting and thinking about what it looks like globally, especially in the global north and in spaces like South Africa and so on. So the questions we asked ourselves, that given these preliminary interventions or programs into the UWI Museum's approach to engaging our public in the pandemic, we recognized that there wasn't a diversity of material available. So if we were going to think about an exhibition, we really had to think about what this would look like. Right? And so our question was, how would we as a museum document the pandemic to provide insight into the impact? What approach do we take? Is it possible to engage in collection, quote unquote, of material? And I want to say here that in the case of museums, there's a difference between acquisition and collecting, right? Collecting suggests a more democratic approach to engaging our public and taking in new objects into our collection, whereas historically, acquire has a very tense history around looting and theft and unethical ways of getting objects. So how do we collect in a manner that adequately reflects our diverse stakeholders, as well as regional basis of the university? And the last kind of the most important question, given that the UWI Museum is more of a historical museum, is what is the nature of the material culture being generated by the pandemic? And all of these things, these questions really help to guide us, or help us to think critically about how we proceeded in our exhibition practice. So our advantage and limitation is a team of two. So if you only have two people, you can only do so much work. However, we were able to expand our efforts through collaborations with colleagues throughout the entire process. The second thing was that the campuses and the Office of the Vice Chancellor generated a lot of data, especially under the COVID-19 task force. And so we had to think about, are we double collecting when we start to identify where and what we're going to collect? And how do we collect in relation or in partnership with the existing infrastructure that exists to collect data? The other thing is, how do we measure what we exhibit? Because the COVID-19 policy and prevention measure environment was fluid. And so we had to think about, wow, how do we get a complete sense of what is happening, and how do we properly exhibit this, and how do what we exhibit or create in the exhibitionary process, how does that function or continue into perpetuity? And so and also last but not least, and this is something that Stanley has presented on as well, the disappearing nature of information. Information was disappearing at an alarming rate during the pandemic. And so this was something that we had to think about when we develop our exhibition. So we concluded between myself and my assistant Samantha, who in essence is also my co-curator, we decided to think about what our approaches. So we identified three. We decided to document the impact of the landscape, impact of the prevention measures on the campus landscape through photography. We also collected records that documented the campus responsiveness, and then we collected also audiovisual material. Now, our journey begins. And so what I'd like to do here is, we have two photographs here, an empty classroom in the Faculty of Medical Science Museum. I think that's where it is. And this one is our, an aerial photograph of Kingsway. And I'm going to explain why this is important. Aerial video recording, rather, of Kingsway. Now, prior to the closure of the campus, the Mona campus on March, after the announcement of March 10, the first case on March 10, it's estimated that the daily population of human beings on the Mona campus, on the 600 acres of Mona campus, is approximately 25,000 people. And this would have included faculty, staff, students, customers, all the things that are necessary to ensure that all the people that are necessary to ensure that the campus ecosystem functions. However, with the advent of the first case in Jamaica, the announcement of the first case in Jamaica in March of 2020, Mona campus closed down. And the act of closing down the campus actually transformed the interaction. For those of us who were doing the skeletal work from office, work situation, and we'd come in occasionally, it was striking that the campus was completely empty, right? And so with permission of the campus, university and campus registrars, in May 2020, we were able, with our colleagues from the Department of History. Hello? Okay, sorry. We were able, with our colleagues from the Department of History and Archaeology, as well as the Faculty of Science and Technology, we began the process of photographing the campus and the emptiness of the campus landscape. And it was a very important experience for us, because one of the things that became clear is that even so for example, the emptiness of halls of residence, when we spoke to informally to persons who are managing halls of residence, just the campus was quiet, and that in many ways the insect life of the population was reasserting itself, because in many ways Mona campus could have afforded to be fallow ground, you know, allow the grass and so on to grow, because fundamentally we were not serving the same volume of persons. And so documenting the changes in the landscape was very important. So from that first exploration, we collected over 600 photographs, both aerial and on-the-ground photographs, between May 29 and June 2. Then we decided that we're gonna collect the institutional. So we collected notices and advisories from Mona messaging. We collected sensitization flyers that were posted every day or every other day on Mona messaging. And then as the time progressed and we knew that the campus had to continue functioning, we also documented the virtual graduation, which would have been the first in the history of the campus, as well as the Vice Chancellor's report and university public sensitization campaign. So the Faculty of Medicine especially did a lot of work in terms of putting out programs, information sessions on what was happening. And we got this was information that was constantly being generated and sent out to us on Mona messaging. So as things changed and the work conditions that were changing, we recognized that it was time, 2 years in, discussions about reopening was happening, but also the face-to-face component. So again, with the permission of the university and Mona campus registrars, we began documenting return to campus, and our collaborators included the Department of History and Archaeology, as well as the Map and Image Library in the Faculty of Science and Technology. Photographing occurred between September 5, 16, and 20, and we received additional permissions from the Faculty of Law to photograph on the building. And so in essence, we collected an additional 200 photographs that effectively documented how the campus functioned, how the campus landscape was ultimately altered, both by the absence of students and the return of students and faculty in September 2020. So once we began concurrently while we are doing the collecting, we're also thinking about our approach to doing the pandemic and doing the exhibition. And so we had to think about, how do we design an exhibition that reflects diversity, that reflects the complexity of the situation? How do we provide correct content that we weren't, as we, Samantha and I are not medical practitioners? And how do we design an exhibition for a situation that was in flux? So our response was to develop a global timeline of the pandemic, a regional timeline of the pandemic, and then a university-based timeline of the pandemic. And yes, this was a lot of time, because ultimately these three timelines, in essence, one, helped us to identify what should be some key turning points in the tour content that we develop. Two, it allowed us to actually have a better understanding of how the pandemic itself was evolving, because the University COVID Task Force ultimately played an important role in advising CARICOM governments. And then by extension, those national policies that govern the response to the pandemic also impacted the campus COVID responses, and each campus had a different set of timelines. And so that helped us to recognize that, we have to be very careful with what we put out there, but also the limitation of operating from a Mona in proximity to the Mona campus. So it did not provide necessarily the truest reflection of how all the landed campuses and the open campus functioned, right? But we recognize that these resources existed. And so one of our responses in the development of the exhibition was to also point out where the resources were to answer these questions, because our exhibition cannot be everything to everybody. At the end of the day, it has to be developed in response to what you have in front of you and what questions you can effectively answer based on the human resource and objects and content that you have there. So what is the material culture that was developed, right? Now, it was very interesting, and this is something that came up especially when we were thinking about the object component of the exhibition. And one of the things that we thought about is you have to sometimes think almost like how archaeologists think, because archaeologists spend a lot of time digging, and in essence, whatever you threw out in the garbage, over time, in essence, becomes part of the findings on an archaeological dig that is, in essence, gives you insight to how some societies would have functioned and evolved. So the question would be, what would we find, right? And the first thing, resoundingly, are masks. So very broadly speaking, masks everywhere are one of the most important material objects that emerge out of the pandemic. So our hands has hand sanitizers, COVID tests, cleaning products, vitamin C, right? Medication, standard recommendations. And now I would also say COVID-19 vaccination cards would be an important part of how we understand the material culture to be. And so each of these form part of our intuitive understanding of the material culture of the pandemic. The other thing too, and it's very important for us to think about, very often people come to the exhibition or they come to a museum and they expect to see things far removed from their person, right? But what this discussion around the COVID-19 exhibition did is that it made the personal political and important. The personal experience in surviving the pandemic is ultimately very important in understanding what would be the memory that is created over time, what is a community memory rather, and how do we proceed. So we want to think about here the engagement of the audience. So the exhibition opened in October 7, 2022. It was invitation only. We left seats in between different persons as a way to recreate what would have happened in a pandemic context, even though we were reopening, and masks were part of that component. So the exhibition opened October 7. One of the things is that we recognized that in many ways, by documenting the institutional response, which is the canceled and postponed events, the advisories, the photographing of the campus landscape, that we were in danger of ignoring or forgetting the individual, because ultimately all of these decisions are made by individual, and it is a human being that sits behind the driver's seat. And so in the second photo here, we have our heritage studies intern, LaShandra Miller, who is an artist, and as part of her internship project, she developed 3 metalwork sculptures. Metalwork pieces, aluminum and copper, to think about the emotional component of the exhibition. As part of her artist process, she engaged her colleagues in the master's program just through a series of conversations. And each of those students had a different perspective on the return to face-to-face. For many persons, for example, and this was coming out of her discussion with us, for many persons, returning to face-to-face was not beneficial to them because they restarted their programs because the pandemic had made online learning so accessible to them. We also recognized that there was a difference between how high school students interacted with the exhibition versus university students. A lot of the high school students were so excited to return to school. They thought it was just a great experience, and that the pandemic was boring, it was isolating, and returning to school was so important to them. One of our interventions in the kind of breaking up of the institutional memory is the invitation for persons to share their COVID words. And we did it that way because we wanted as much as possible to invite interaction and reflection on the pandemic, right? At the point at which we opened in October 7, the campus had not returned to its pre-March 10 context. And even though I think we can all agree that the campus is still building itself coming out of the pandemic. And so people had different feelings about the pandemic. And I'm thinking about this kind of just in terms of the conversations that emerged. And so the invitation to have persons share their COVID word was a very important part of getting the nuances in the in our visitorship. The second one was the in memorial wall. No, it's not as populated as the COVID experience wall, and it's partly because there are some ethical considerations in the kind of invitation for having people to participate in an experience that in essence is still emotional and personal and ongoing. Coming out of the responses from the COVID word wall was as one of our blog posts, we developed a word bubble, using the words that heavily dominated on the wall. And of course, as expected, the pressing was one that was there. In some of it, depression, the pressing. For some people, they enjoyed the pandemic. They had a whole process of self-discovery. They dreamed. But for the most part, the tension, the pandemic produced a lot of tension. And we definitely are aware of the findings of the Capri report on the vulnerabilities coming out of the COVID pandemic in the case of Jamaica. And there are reports in the region as well that are a part of reflecting on the impact of the pandemic. What are the ethical considerations? Now, one of the things is that a lot of our commentary is informal because the pandemic fundamentally altered social interaction, but also grief practices in the country and in the region and globally. And so we had to make provisions for persons. So we provided a kind of separate space. It's also a recording space, but it's a separate space where persons needed time to create some distance from what the content in the exhibition, that they had the privacy to do so. We also, in our interviews, we have the standard interview permission forms. When we were photographing, we also did permission forms for persons, especially if their photos were going to pop up in what we were doing. And this was a little bit easier to do in the beginning because the university was operating on a skeletal staff, and so persons were willing, they were willing for us to share their photo. But we've actually tried as much as possible not to share too many photos where people's faces are identifiable. And we try as much as possible to respect persons, their feelings. We acknowledge that some of the exhibition can be triggering for some people. They lost more than one loved one during the pandemic, even though it's not necessarily because of COVID. And then in terms of our other work, we've collaborated with the university archives as well to document. So we're trying to keep track, just kind of working with them in terms of the oral history component, interviewing key persons on the task force, engaging like a kind of sample set of colleagues about how their departments responded, so that in the long term, there is an availability of information. How do we protect this data? Well, if persons want to use it, they actually have to formally request access to it. And we've backed up our data in multiple forums, also in terms of our relationship too with the university archives. So I hope this was a very useful overview, and I'm open to take questions at this time.
Very useful indeed. Thank you very much. Quite a journey you took us on, and you actually have a very particular way of envisioning and interpreting and making information available. So we definitely need this line of analysis. Shani, as always, it's a privilege, a pleasure having you and always talking to you and having you share with us this afternoon. This is our last department seminar for this academic year. We go into our assessment season just now, and we'll wrap up the semester and the year just now.